Hey everybody, it's Lori. I wanted to make a video today talking about some books that I have read in the last 6 months or so. Some of them are books I have read for the first time, and some are rereads that kind of deal with the topic of systemic racism. So, there's not a particular order to the books I have chosen. It actually started, I've been reading and listening to quite a few books this month dealing with systemic racism in one form or another, and it got me kind of thinking while I was listening to one of these books about the different books that I have read or listened to recently that kind of deal with this problem and come at it from different angles or different interest areas. So that's just kind of how I'm going to do this, is I'm going to talk about each book briefly, who might want to read this book. If you're interested in a certain topic, one of these might be a better choice than another. And this list is kind of meant for people like me who have a certain amount of white privilege and may pretty frequently not think about that. I am someone who has been aware of systemic racism for a long time, going back to majoring in sociology, and when I was in graduate school, as a teaching assistant, I got to do white privilege exercises with my students. So I will go ahead and try to find a video of a similar exercise and link it down below for those of you who may be less familiar with the concept of white privilege. So I'm just going to go ahead and get into these books. The first book I want to talk about I listened to recently, and that is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. This is the only fiction book on my list, not for any particular reason. I just have read more nonfiction books dealing with systemic racism than fiction books. So if you love fiction, this would be a great place to start. It's also a young adult novel, so it's accessible for people who prefer YA, or for slightly younger people. There is a small amount of like sexual content and things like that, and quite a bit of violence that happens in the book. So if those are triggers for your younger readers, your teen and tween readers, this might be one to wait a while on. It's basically the story of a young black girl who's kind of caught between two worlds because she lives kind of in the projects, and she goes to a white school in another neighborhood, a majority white school, private school. I can't remember if it's private or charter, but she goes outside her community for school, and so she feels kind of trapped between them. And then she has this situation where one of her friends is killed in a traffic stop by a police officer. So that's kind of the setup for the book. And it follows this young lady as she tries to process this death of her friend, and as she figures out how to stand up for her friend, and what she can do. It is not a like happy ending sort of book necessarily, but I think it treats the subject of systemic racism in terms of dealing with police officers in a very enlightening manner for someone like me. The next book that I want to talk about is a much older book. This is a book that I read back in my intro to sociology class in the late 90s. And I reread it in November for Nonfiction November. And that is Friday Night Lights by H.G. Bissinger. So Friday Night Lights is a football book, and I am not a football person, so it's not something that appeals to me because of the sports. But if you do love sports, this might be a great start for kind of learning a little bit more about systemic racism. Obviously, we read this in Intro to Sociology, so if you're interested in sociology and sociological thought, this is a good one to read as well. It, as I said, is an older book. Basically tells the story of a football team in Odessa, Texas, and they have a particular player, a black player, who injures himself, and so his life is very much changed by his injury in the book. But it goes through their season up to like the playoffs or state finals. I don't remember how far they went because it's football, and I was much more interested in the people than the football aspect of it. But it talks very much about race issues in this little town in Texas. And the author became rather unpopular with the town after he published this because it's clear that there is difficulties with racism in this town, and the schools had not been integrated very long at the time of this book. I believe it's set in like 88, might be the season. And it's kind of mind blowing. I remember back in college thinking, wow, that wasn't that long ago. But now, with me being older, I realize how very not long ago that is at all. I don't know why it seems like less time now that I'm older. One of those things about age. So, if you would like to kind of tackle the topic of systemic racism, and you like football or sociology, you might enjoy Friday Night Lights. There is a TV show based on this and a movie based on this. I have not seen either, so I don't know how true to the source material they are. I think from what I have seen, the movie might be truer to the source material than the TV show. Next one I want to talk about is also another kind of sociology-ish book, and that is Thick and Other Essays by Tressie McMillan Cottom. Now, she is a sociologist. I cannot remember what college she is associated with or was at the time of the publication of this collection of essays. This is one that I listened to on Audible. We picked it up on an Audible daily deal because it sounded interesting. So she is a Black woman and a sociologist, and all of the different essays talk about her experiences as a Black woman in society. And so a lot of them are very eye-opening. One in particular was just devastating for me, and it was one dealing with the healthcare system and what happened to her because of the assumptions about her based upon her race, that like medical outcomes sometimes very, very much depend on the race of the person involved. So because I have had similar health issues and things like that, and I've had some difficulties in the healthcare setting, I was just devastated hearing how much worse it was in her case. So that was a really hard one to listen to. I don't remember what the name of that essay was, but Thick and Other Essays is definitely worth picking up and reading or listening to. The next one is a book I just recently finished, and that is Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Bendy. This is a great one for history lovers. I ended up listening to this on Spotify because the author made it available for free on Spotify, which was great because I was ordering some books around that time, and because so many people are ordering books dealing with racism and systemic injustice, they've been taking a long time to get here. So it was nice to just be able to stick in my headphones and listen to this book. It is a big book. It covers the history of race in the United States, starting at the very beginning and going to, think maybe this was published in 2017, 2018, so that whole period of time. And it talks about so many bits of history that I was personally unaware of, or things that I knew a little bit about but didn't know very much about. He just focuses in on all of the details. One of the things I found particularly interesting in here is the number of movies. I don't watch a ton of movies, so I hadn't seen most of the movies he discussed, like Tarzan and Planet of the Apes and King Kong. I did not realize that there was a racial component with all of those movies. It's not something I ever would have noticed, being someone who A, hasn't seen any of those movies, and B, is lucky enough to be able to overlook things like that because it doesn't affect me personally. So, Stamped from the Beginning, excellent book. It's on the longer side, but if you love history, you will love that book and just how thorough it is in going through step by step from the beginning of our nation to very recently. Another book that I read a few months ago was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and this is by Rebecca Skloot. Now, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks talks about a black woman, Henrietta Lacks, whose cancerous cells, she died from a cancer. Her cancerous cells became the first cells that could be kind of kept alive, so they're like the immortal cells. They're the HeLa cells, and they're used, I guess, in a lot of scientific and medical research. And I'm not a sciencey person, but I had kind of been going through a series of books, and this one came up and caught my interest. So the part I find most interesting isn't so much the scientific researchy stuff, because that's just not my thing. But if you do like information about that, that might be fascinating for you in this. But the author trying to meet with the family and get to know the family and find out more about what happened, that was the very interesting part for me. The fact that Henrietta could only be treated at one particular hospital because she was black. She was not that far from slave ancestors. She kind of grew up on a plantation type thing. But like just listening to the story of Henrietta Lacks as told by the author, who is basically researching this along with Henrietta's daughter, who never really knew her mother. It's fascinating, everything about this story, and kind of terrifying how this family was not even aware that these cells were taken and used for medical research. And of course, some of that is just changes in how medical research is done legally at this point. So it's a crazy story, but you can see in it a lot of this systemic injustice that has led to her family being in the position they're in versus perhaps a different type of family. The next one I want to talk about is a great book. I have not seen the movie for this yet. I'm going to, but it's going to be hard. And that is Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. So if you have an interest in law or criminology, this is the place you should definitely start. This is an excellent book. So Bryan Stevenson is a lawyer and a black man, and he starts kind of a foundation to help people on death row. And of course, a majority of the people on death row happen to be black. And there are stories told of these cases where men are on death row and he is working to help them, where it's just clearly 100% the racism of the law enforcement that has caused this person to be on death row in the first place. And like just so much corruption and terrible things are happening in some of these stories. Bryan Stevenson, I believe his organization is the Equal Justice Initiative, and that's one that a lot of people are donating money to right now to help out with these sorts of things. There's lots of great causes that you can be donating money to, but the Equal Justice Initiative, I believe, is Bryan Stevenson's organization. So read this book. Like, I think this is a great one for pretty much everyone, because you don't realize how little you know about how the legal system works and how the criminal justice system works if you are outside of that. And then the last one I want to mention that I have read in the last 6 months or so is another older book, and I do happen to have it around, and that is Savage Inequalities, Children in America's Schools by Jonathan Kozol. This, again, is an older book, and it's looking at the It's looking at this systemic racism in school districts. It talks very much about all of the different educational things. So if you are an educator or if you work with kids in some setting, this might be a great place to start. It's just amazing how even attempts to improve schools cause sometimes this even more disparity between schools. So there's a lot of different things that Jonathan Kozol talks about in here, and you'll find details of these schools that like just have nothing, and then compare them to other schools that are not very far away that have all sorts of resources. Since this is an older book, like the resources are like they had a couple computers in their library, so I don't imagine that the situation isn't also still very disparate in what the wealthy schools have versus the poorer schools. But I'm sure the poorer schools do have more technology in this technological age than they did back when this book was written. This is one I'd love to find some more books about this topic that are a little more modern, but I haven't found anything as of yet. So those are just some of the books that I have read recently that I think would be a good jumping off point for learning more about systemic racism. So those are the ones I've already read. I do have 3 more, one I'm reading, one I will be reading soon, and one has not arrived here, that I have recently purchased. So you can look forward to me reviewing these sometime in the future. I have started White Rage. I'm not very far into this one, and that is by Carol Anderson. And I just got yesterday White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. These 2 books were recommended by the booktuber Books with Shay. And she is kind of having a read along. I haven't been keeping up because it took so long to get these books in, but because I want to be able to pass them around, I wanted hard copies instead of digital copies. Plus, I just find nonfiction to be easier for me in a hard copy form most of the time. So these are 2 that I will be reading soon. This book I picked up is This Book is Anti-Racist by Tiffany Jewell. And this is one that my daughter Eva asked me to pick up for her. It was very hard for me to find. Amazon didn't have it available. And just like lots of bookstores were out of it. So where I did order it from, I don't think it's shipped yet. So I'm starting to think they didn't have it in stock either. And they were just assuming they would eventually. So at some point we will get that one in as well. And I would like to read that as well as Eva. So I'll probably be reviewing those 3 books in the next month or 2, hopefully, if the 3rd one ever shows up. So that is all I have for today. Please feel free to subscribe if you like videos about books. Go ahead and like this if you are looking for more books that you might like to read. Leave me a comment below if you have more books on the topic of systemic racism that you would recommend that you have read. I would love to know more. Other than that, I guess I will see you all in my next video. Thanks. Bye.